right, so we're going to carry on with our tour of a Java-based serverless REST API in AWS being backed by an S3 data store for a quotes REST API. So in the previous video, we covered the creational endpoint where you can make a post to an endpoint that looks like this here on the screen, a post request to the quotes URI, and then passing it the body of that request, message, source URL, and author. And it saves that to S3, which we verified by using the AWS CLI to list the S3 bucket. So in this video, we're going to do the read side of the equation of a CRUD REST API, right? So we're going to see how we can list out the contents of the S3 backend data store and return those quotes in JSON form via some GET requests. All right, so when working with SAM, I usually start always in my template, in my SAM or CloudFormation template. And so what I'll do is I'll create another serverless AWS function resource here, but this one is going to be mapped to a GET request. So I'm going to go ahead and copy what I have there, and I'll paste it below it. And then I'll update the name of this to list quotes function. And that's going to map to a class that I'll create, which is list quotes, and then a request handler method inside of that class. And we're still going to need to be able to access our S3 bucket. So we'll need our quotes bucket environment variable. And I'll need an S3 policy, which gives me read access. There is a variant, which is just S3 read policy. However, I have no problem just leaving it as a CRUD policy. So I'm going to give it that full read, write, delete access. And then the path will still be quotes, but this time it's going to be a GET request rather than a post. And so that's really all that's required to update the CloudFormation template. Is we add a new Lambda function resource that is provided through the AWS Serverless function, Serverless Application Model resource. And now, so we just need the corresponding Java code to implement the Lambda function. All right, so I'll come down in here to the coding interface quotes package, and I'll add a new Java class. So this Java class is going to be list quotes, just like we see here in my handler definition. So list quotes, and then I'll come over to my create quotes, and I'll use that as my template or my cheat sheet, right? So I have the create quotes over here on the right. I'm gonna clean that up just a touch. I don't like unused imports. So I need to implement the request handler, and then that's going to be going to use the generic stating an API gateway request event, and then an API gateway proxy response event. So API gateway proxy response event. Very good. So now I can implement the missing method, which is just the handle request. Just like that. Very good. I can get rid of this over here, or at least shrink it up. And in the implementation of my handle request method of the underlying request handler interface, very first thing is I will create a response object again. So a lot like what I see right here in my original create quote handler. So var response equals new API gateway response event. And then we'll say with headers map of, and I'm gonna import the map class from the utils package. And I'll come over here and I'll copy the headers, just like that. All right, so now what I'll do is I'm going to create another instance of my quotes S3 repository, right? So var quotes repo equals new quotes S3 repository. And again, we got to give it the environment variable for the quotes bucket that gets injected via my CM template. And then from the context parameter, my logger. All right, so I will use the quotes repo list method to list the quotes that are saved in S3. And then that's, of course, going to return to me a list of quotes. So let me import my list. All right, there we go. And then I'm going to want to serialize this back out to JSON. And of course, we're using JSON to do our serialization with. So JSON equals a new instance of the JSON class. And then I'll return with response with status code of HTTP connection URL, HTTP OK, which is a 200, right? Like that. And then we'll give it a body of JSON to JSON, and that's going to be my quotes list. Now, of course, I haven't implemented the list implementation, so that's just an unimplemented set of an empty body, right? So let's use the AWS S3 library from the AWS Java SDK to list the contents of that S3 bucket. And so the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to instantiate an array list, because that's what we want to return, right? So we see the return is a list of quotes. So quote quotes equals new array list. And then I mentioned previously that when we use the AWS S3 library, it always follows a pretty similar pattern where you create a request object and then you use that request object with a specific method on the S3 client to perform an action. So let's make that request right now. So list objects request, call the builder on it, and then we give it the bucket, which is our bucket name, held in this field right here and passed in via the constructor in this line right here, which originates from the environment variable injected in the SAM template coming from the S3 resource that's created, right? Just to make sure everyone fully understands where that's coming from. And then we just call build, and now we have a request object of type list objects request. So let's make a response, or let's dig out the response using the S3 client of list objects and giving it that request object. All right, so this will give us back a list of S3 objects, and we'll call that objects, and that's going to be equal to the response contents. And now I can expose an iterator on that and iterate over every object that is in S3 in that specific bucket, and then parse those out into quote objects. Because as you can see down here, every quote is saved via this key right here of the form author name, and then the hash of the contents of the quote, which is the file name of a JSON file. So I mentioned we're going to iterate over this, so let's create an iterator. So let's say var iter for iterator, and then objects list iterator. And we'll say while iter has next, we'll parse out or grab the object from the iterator. So S3 object equals S3 object from iter next. And then I'll actually call another helper method down here, which is going to be used to fetch a quote, or maybe said another way, downloading a quote. So let's come down here to where we put our other more packaged private helper methods, and let's create one that downloads a quote. So let's say quote download from key string, and this is the S3 key. And of course, we're going to be using the S3 client again. So what do we always do? We create a request object, and then we use the S3 client with that request object to perform an action in S3. So var request equals get object request builder bucket name key passed into the method, and then we call build. All right, so now we have a request object, and we'll use the S3 client to call get object, passing it that request object, and then we want to specify that we want to get raw bytes back from this request. So we can use the response transformer 2 bytes. And this is going to respond back with our response in bytes. So response bytes, and that's a get object response. So that's my response right there. And we can see that incompatible type. This isn't a request, this is a response. All right, so now we're going to use JSON because we're obviously going to do some serialization from JSON back to a Java POJO, which is our quote POJO, right? Our quote class. New JSON, and then we'll say quote equals JSON, and we'll actually make this a var keyword instead. JSON from JSON response as string standard character set back to UTF-8, and of course the quote class is what we use to map the JSON fields to the quote POJO. And I can now return quote. So this downloads the S3 JSON file by the S3 key. So S3 key, it would download that Donald Guth quote. Awesome, let's use that then. So here we do quotes, and we'll just add to the list, and we'll call download from S3 key, and we have that S3 object there, and we can call get key on it, or just call key. And then we'll return quotes. Now obviously, this has a probability This is a networked request to throw an exception somewhere along the way. So let's wrap everything in a try catch with a fairly broad exception of just E, and we can call logger log failed to list quotes, and then let's say logger log E, get the message of the exception, and open up our try block. We can take all this and stick it in there, get rid of some extra spaces, and that should be our implementation, right? So we create an empty list, create a request object on our bucket of type list objects request. We get a list objects response back, iterate through those objects, and then download each object. I'll download the contents of each object, adding to our quotes list, returning our quotes list. And then we used another helper method in here, download from key, which downloads each S3 object and parses that into a quote class instance. So that should give us the functionality that we're interested in. So let's build and deploy. So let's go back down here into my terminal. I'll do sam build. And then sam deploy. And remember, I don't have to add any extra parameters or go through the guided prompts because all of my previously used settings were saved here in my sam config.toml, which is a pretty nice little feature. All right, so we can see that it's creating a new deployment, it's creating a new Lambda function. So we're adding a Lambda function, we're modifying the REST API itself because we're adding a new endpoint, and things are progressing down here. Almost finished. All right, successfully updated. So let me grab my REST API URL again. And I think that's what I'll do is I'll actually add another quote so we have at least 2 quotes to return in the list rather than just one. So we'll do a post again to the quotes endpoint, and we'll say author. I have another quote sitting here. This will be John Wodes, who made the quote, and his quote, which is kind of funny, always code as if the guy who ends up maintaining your code will be a violent sociopath who knows where you live. That is hilarious, and I love it. So message is equal to that. And then source URL, let's grab that also. Post that up. All right, so we should now have 2 quotes in there, right? One from Donald Kooth and one from John Woods. So if I do a GET request now on that endpoint rather than a post, we should see those. So HTTP, the default is a GET request, so I don't need to specify GET. And obviously, this takes a little bit, because we're working with object storage right now. We're not working with a blazing fast database, but that's sort of the trade-offs that we make for the lower cost. All right, so we got 2 quotes back, right? So we got the one from Donald Guth, and we got the other one from John Woods. Right on. Well, that was a lot faster of a video than the first one, and I like to try to keep them small. So I think we'll call it a wrap there. And in the next video, I will show how to fetch an individual quote rather than a list of quotes, and it'll be by the ID here. All right, hope you found that interesting. Thanks for joining, and please catch the rest of the video series.